They told him never to move. Not for noise, not for threats, and certainly not for royal family matters. But on a spring morning at Horse Guards Parade, as a 10-year-old girl fought back tears in full public view, Sergeant Adam Kessler saw something no soldier should ever ignore. It wasn't a terrorist, it wasn't a protest, it was Queen Camilla. And what she said, and did, to Princess Charlotte in those moments, was enough to make a Coldstream Guard step over the chain and break protocol for the first time in over 300 years. Before I show you exactly what happened when the camera stopped smiling, make sure you're subscribed and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. The morning sun hit Horse Guards Parade like honey poured over ancient stone. Spring in London carries its own particular light, soft and golden, the kind that makes tourists pause mid-conversation and reach for cameras without quite understanding why. Magnolia trees bloomed along the edges of the square, their petals drifting occasionally across cobblestones that had witnessed centuries of ceremony, celebration, and the quiet weight of history being made. Today felt different, though nobody could say exactly how. The crowd pressed against the barriers with that familiar mix of reverence and excitement you only see at places where tradition still breathes. German tourists had claimed the prime spots hours earlier, telephoto lenses glinting like artillery. American families clutched guidebooks and checked phones for the perfect angle. A Japanese film crew had set up what looked like a small broadcasting operation and showed no signs of moving until the final note faded. Everyone wanted to witness the Royal Horse Artillery's anniversary commemoration, the kind of pageantry that draws people from around the world to stand on London streets and remember that some things are bigger than themselves. Behind the polished barriers, separated by brass chains and the quiet presence of palace security, a much smaller enclosure had been prepared for the royal family. Most visitors never even noticed it was there. Tour guides didn't point it out. Cameras lingered only with permission. At the centre of this protected space stood Queen Camilla in dove grey wool, every line deliberate, every movement choreographed for the watching lenses. Her smile moved from left to right with practiced precision, timed to the rhythm of shutters clicking. But if you knew how to look, really look, you'd notice the smile never quite reached her eyes. Beside her stood Princess Charlotte of Wales, 10 years old, with the kind of sharp, clear features that marked her unmistakably as royal. Her powder blue coat was pressed, but not quite perfect. One button hung slightly askew, the hem twisted from some hurried adjustment backstage. She held herself with practiced poise, the kind that only comes from years of being told exactly how to stand, how to breathe, how to exist under scrutiny. But there was something in her posture that didn't match the polish. Something careful, defensive. Sergeant Adam Kessler saw it immediately. He stood 30 paces away in the Coldstream Guards formation, second from centre, still as carved stone beneath the towering bearskin that crowned his 6'2" frame. His hands cradled the SA-80 rifle with parade-ground precision, boots aligned to the millimetre, on the exact spot where ceremonial protocol demanded he remain until the final salute. But his eyes moved constantly. At 34, Kessler was older than most guards, rotating through ceremonial duties. 2 tours in Afghanistan had given him those eyes, the survival habit of reading crowds, measuring distances, spotting the subtle signals that separated normal behaviour from potential threat. Where tourists saw pageantry, he noticed the man checking exits instead of taking photos, the woman tracking guard movements instead of soaking up spectacle. His left shoulder carried a dull ache where shrapnel had found its mark during his final patrol in Helmand, the injury that eventually brought him home and into the scarlet tunic he now wore. Some of his mates saw ceremonial posting as a step down from active combat. Kessler understood it differently. The threat environment had changed, not disappeared. Here, in the heart of London, vigilance was still survival. Standing motionless for hours was its own kind of endurance test, but he had learned to use the stillness productively. His training kicked in automatically, catalogue faces, track patterns, note small inconsistencies that might matter when seconds counted. Right now, something was making those old instincts whisper warnings. It wasn't the crowd. The tourists behaved exactly as expected, pressed against barriers with phones ready, that reverent buzz of anticipation that came before any major ceremony. It was the royal section that bothered him. Princess Charlotte stood exactly where she'd been positioned, wearing exactly what she'd been told to wear, but her body language told a different story. She looked tense. Not excited tense. Worried tense. The kind of defensive positioning he'd seen in civilians caught between hostile forces, shoulders slightly rounded, weight shifted back on her heels, ready to retreat if necessary. Next to her, Queen Camilla maintained that photographer's smile while her hand rested on Charlotte's shoulder. From a distance, it looked protective, grandmotherly. Up close, Kessler could see the grip was firmer than it needed to be, the kind that guided rather than comforted. Charlotte's gaze kept drifting toward his position. Quick glances at first, then longer looks, like something about his presence either unsettled or steadied her. With a child that well trained to hide feelings, it was impossible to tell which. But Kessler had seen this pattern before. In Kandahar, there had been a local interpreter's daughter who'd attended briefings with her father, maybe 8 years old, perfectly behaved, never spoke unless spoken to. But she'd watched the British soldiers the same way, not with curiosity but with assessment, trying to figure out which adults were safe and which weren't. The girl's father had been feeding intelligence to the Taliban. When they'd finally arrested him, she hadn't run to her father. She'd run to Kessler's sergeant and held on until the dust settled. Later, they'd discovered the father had been beating her for months. She'd learned to read soldiers because soldiers meant rescue from the person who was supposed to protect her. Charlotte's eyes held that same careful measurement now, but Kessler had seen this pattern before. In Kandahar, there'd been a local interpreter's daughter who'd attended briefings with her father. Maybe 8 years old, perfectly behaved, never spoke unless spoken to, but she'd watched the British soldiers the same way. Not with curiosity, but with assessment, trying to figure out which adults were safe and which weren't. The girl's father had been feeding intelligence to the Taliban. When they'd finally arrested him during a pre-dawn raid, she'd been there in the compound, and when the shooting started, she hadn't run to her father. She'd run to Kessler's sergeant, grabbed his tactical vest, and held on until the dust settled. Later they'd discovered why. The father had been beating her for months. She'd learned to read soldiers because soldiers meant rescue from the person who was supposed to protect her. Charlotte's eyes held that same careful measurement now. The band struck up their opening formation, brass instruments calling across the courtyard in melodies that seemed to rise from the stones themselves. Guards began moving into final positions, boots striking cobblestone in perfect unison. Kessler remained locked to his post. In 12 years since leaving Afghanistan, 8 since he'd stopped jumping at car doors slamming, 3 since taking his first ceremonial assignment, he'd never broken formation, not once. Not when protesters had thrown bottles during the state visit. Not when that drunk German tourist last summer had screamed abuse inches from his face. But something about this morning pressed differently against his chest. Charlotte looked toward him again. Not a glance this time. A real look. Direct, searching, like she was trying to decide something important. Her chin trembled once, so briefly he almost missed it. Kessler's breathing stayed controlled. One inhale every 8 seconds, the way they'd taught him, but his instincts started whispering louder. The same instincts that had warned him about roadside bombs in Sangjin, that had felt the shift in air pressure before sniper rounds. Something wasn't right here. From the crowd's perspective, they saw royal elegance in action. A grandmother showing her granddaughter the pride of tradition, both framed by polished brass, and centuries of history. Picture perfect. The reality was something else entirely. Queen Camilla leaned down, bringing her mouth level with Charlotte's ear. Her smile stayed frozen for the photographers, but her voice carried that particular edge that cuts without raising volume. Chin up, back straight. Stop slouching like you're waiting for a bus. Charlotte didn't respond, didn't flinch either, but her jaw tightened and her gaze dropped to the cobblestones beneath her polished shoes. Kessler saw the shift from 30 yards away, the barely visible tremor in the girl's hands, the way she rolled her shoulders, not to loosen tension, but to brace against it. Camilla's hand moved from Charlotte's shoulder to her wrist. Still looked gentle from a distance. Wasn't. Kessler recognized that grip from his time overseas, the kind used in crowds to control without attracting attention. Fingers pressed just hard enough to sting without leaving marks. "Don't embarrass me," Camilla continued, her whisper barely audible. "Your breathing is too loud. This isn't some school play. You're representing the crown." Charlotte nodded silently. That was the part that made Kessler's gut clench. She'd heard this before, often enough to know exactly how to respond, how to minimize the consequences of disappointing someone who held power over her daily life. He watched Charlotte more closely now, not as a ceremonial guard, but as someone who'd seen pressure break people in ways that didn't always show. The way she stood wasn't confident royal posture. It was defensive positioning, the look of someone who'd learned that making herself smaller was safer than taking up space. Camilla moved again, adjusting Charlotte's coat with unnecessary force, smoothing fabric that didn't need smoothing. Her fingers found the girl's collarbone, thumb pressing inward just enough to make her point. "Eyes forward. Stop looking around like a tourist. You are not here to gawk. You are here to perform." Charlotte's composure wavered. Her lower lip trembled before she caught it between her teeth. She was 10 years old and fighting not to cry, while hundreds of people watched her be perfect. Kessler's grip on his rifle tightened fractionally, not enough for anyone to notice, but enough to feel his own tension building. He'd been trained to recognize distress in all its forms, but no training had prepared him for recognizing it wrapped in royal blue and hidden behind ceremonial smiles. Charlotte looked toward him again. This time her gaze lingered, like she was trying to communicate something she couldn't say aloud. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears. Something cracked inside his chest, some barrier between duty to protocol and duty to basic human decency. His mind flashed back to Helmand, to a little Afghan girl who'd approached their checkpoint with her father. She'd been maybe Charlotte's age, same wide eyes, same careful way of standing when adults were talking above her head. They'd turned them away that day. Orders were orders. 2 days later, mortar fire hit the family's compound. When the medics got there, they found the girl first. She hadn't made it. Kessler had carried that weight for 8 years. The knowledge that sometimes following orders meant failing the people you were supposed to protect. But he still didn't move. Couldn't move. Not yet. Even though keeping that oath might mean watching another child suffer in silence while he stood and did nothing. A spring breeze stirred the forecourt, lifting flags and catching one loose strand of Charlotte's precisely pinned hair. It curled across her cheek as the pale blue ribbon that held it slipped down toward her shoulder. It should have been a charming moment, something that might have made her smile. Instead, it triggered something much worse. Camilla's eyes locked onto the loose ribbon immediately. Her entire body went rigid, that frozen smile stretching tighter. Her hand shot out with sudden precision, clamping down on Charlotte's upper arm. From the rope line, it looked protective. The reality was different. Kessler could see the angle of the grip, the tension in Charlotte's neck, the tiny wince she tried to hide. The words came hissed through clenched teeth, quiet enough that only someone trained to read lips could make them out. "You're a disgrace." Charlotte's left shoulder dipped involuntarily. For the first time since stepping into the forecourt, her carefully maintained composure began to crack. Camilla pulled her toward the interior of the royal section, just a step out of the crowd's direct line of sight. Her grip shifted higher, fingers digging into the soft tissue, where no cameras would catch the marks that would form later. Kessler didn't blink, didn't shift his stance, but the cold weight in his chest crystallized into something harder. He'd seen officers look away from things they didn't want to report, heard the sound of complicit silence when those in power abused it. Charlotte's voice came then, small, raw, barely more than a whisper. "Please don't." Not shouted, not performed, just said, like a prayer that didn't expect an answer. But Kessler heard it. His training had sharpened his hearing to pick up whispers through chaos, distant threats through closer noise, emotion through careful control. Those two words rang in his bones, louder than artillery fire. He wasn't the only one who heard it. A palace aide standing 15 feet away turned slightly, his polite smile faltering as he processed what had just reached his ears. The man's eyes flicked between Charlotte and Camilla, then toward the security detail positioned along the garden wall. For a moment, his hand moved toward the radio clipped to his belt. Then he stopped, hesitated. The same calculation Kessler had seen in junior officers who witnessed things they weren't supposed to report. The weight of hierarchy pressing down on conscience. The aide's hand dropped back to his side. He turned away, resuming his ceremonial position as if nothing had happened. But Kessler caught the micro-expression that crossed his face first. Disgust, followed immediately by the practiced blankness that comes from years of learning when to look the other way. Charlotte turned her head, looking back with wide, wet eyes. Her gaze found his past Camilla. Past the ceremonial chains, past every rule that kept him frozen in place. For 1 second, the entire courtyard seemed to slow down around them. Then Charlotte's voice cracked as she spoke again, this time loud enough for others to hear. "Please, help me." The words cut through the morning air like a blade. Several tourists looked up from their cameras, confused, uncertain they'd heard correctly. But Sergeant Adam Kessler had no uncertainty at all. The rifle in his hands suddenly felt different, lighter, more like a tool than a ceremonial prop. Behind him stood 3 centuries of unbroken tradition, generations of guards who had never moved from their posts without direct orders. In front of him stood a 10-year-old girl asking for help that no one else was willing to provide. He shifted his weight, felt his right boot lift from the ancient cobblestone. Then he took the first step. The sound echoed across the forecourt like a gunshot. The crowd's reaction was immediate and electric. Gasps rippled through the barriers as phones swung toward the unprecedented sight of a royal guard abandoning his position. The band faltered, brass instruments trailing off mid-note as musicians turned to see what was causing the disruption. Kessler kept walking. 2 steps, 3, 4, each one deliberate, controlled, inevitable as gravity. He wasn't rushing, just moving with the steady purpose of someone who'd finally decided that some things mattered more than rules. Camilla turned at the sound, her hand dropping from Charlotte's arm as she processed what was happening. Her head swiveled in slow disbelief, lips curling as if what approached violated some fundamental law of nature. "Return to your post immediately." Kessler didn't answer, didn't slow down either. Charlotte had backed away from Camilla now, placing a trembling hand on the ceremonial chain that separated the royal section from the public area. She stood between worlds, the frightened child on one side, the weight of the crown on the other. The only thing approaching her was the man in scarlet. Kessler reached the chain. Protocol said that's where he stopped, where every guard had always stopped, but protocol was already broken. He stepped over. In full view of every camera, every diplomat, every security officer in the forecourt, Sergeant Kessler crossed into the royal enclosure. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was charged with the electricity of witnessing something that had never happened before. Camilla took a half step forward, her mask of composure slipping just enough to show the calculation behind it. "You're making a fool of yourself." Kessler's response carried across the courtyard, firm and even and impossible to ignore. "She asked for help, Ma'am." And I heard her. He looked down at Charlotte, not with pity but with recognition, the acknowledgement of someone who understood what it meant to be trapped by circumstances beyond your control. "I heard her," he repeated. Camilla's composure cracked completely for just a moment. Disbelief flashed across her features, followed by outrage, then the quick mental calculation of someone realizing that every eye in the forecourt was now watching her. She glanced toward the plainclothes security officers positioned near the garden walls, expecting them to restore order. None moved, because they could see what everyone else could see now. This wasn't a breach of security, this was protection. Charlotte took a small step closer to Kessler's side, not grabbing him or hiding behind him, just positioning herself where she felt safer. She didn't need to speak again. Her choice said everything. Camilla's voice dropped to a hiss. You will lose your post for this." Kessler's posture remained unchanged. Military bearing, rifle properly held, every inch the professional soldier. He didn't argue, didn't justify, didn't plead. He simply stood where duty had placed him, between a frightened child and someone who had been hurting her. Behind them, the band tried to recover their rhythm. But no one was listening to the music anymore. Every lens, every face, every pair of eyes in the forecourt was trained on the single guard in scarlet who had just rewritten 3 centuries of precedent. And the 10-year-old princess now standing beside him, protected for the first time in her life by someone who'd chosen her safety over his career. The standoff lasted maybe 30 seconds, long enough for every camera to capture what was happening, long enough for the significance to sink in. A royal guard had abandoned his post to protect a member of the royal family from another member of the royal family. The first plainclothes officer broke the spell, stepping into the royal section with quiet authority. But he didn't move toward Kessler. He approached Camilla. A second officer joined him, then a third. They didn't touch her, didn't raise voices, didn't create a scene. Just positioned themselves with the kind of professional courtesy that made their message unmistakable. Camilla stared at them, then at Kessler, then finally at Charlotte, the girl who had just brought down 3 centuries of tradition with 2 words. "This is outrageous," she said, but her voice had lost its edge. "You're going to take her word over mine?" The lead officer's response was diplomatically neutral. "Ma'am, we need to step back and assess the situation." It wasn't her word against Charlotte's anymore. It was everyone's eyes against the story she'd been telling about herself. But Camilla wasn't finished. Years of navigating royal protocol had taught her how to salvage impossible situations. Her voice dropped to that particular tone, the powerful use when they're still holding cards others can't see. This child has been under tremendous pressure. The death of her great-grandmother, the changes in the family structure, the constant media attention. Perhaps what we witnessed was simply overwhelm, a moment of confusion. The words were perfectly chosen, clinical, reasonable. They offered everyone an exit strategy that preserved dignity all around. Several aides nodded slightly. It was a plausible narrative. Children did act out under stress, royal children especially. And Camilla's public reputation was built on decades of careful image management. But then Charlotte spoke, not to the officers, not to her grandmother. She looked directly at Kessler and said, in a voice that carried clearly across the stone courtyard, "She told me I was weak, like my mummy was weak." The words landed with the force of falling masonry. Every conversation in the vicinity stopped. The aide with the radio actually stepped backward, as if distance could protect him from what he'd just heard. Because everyone knew what Charlotte meant. Everyone knew the story of her mother's struggles, the pressures that had nearly broken Diana, the comparisons that had haunted the royal family for decades. Camilla looked around the forecourt once more, taking in the cameras, the crowd, the guards who had stopped their ceremony to watch her. Then she turned and walked toward the private archway, followed by an aide who suddenly found urgent need to study the cobblestones beneath his feet. No tantrum, no scene, just the kind of strategic withdrawal that powerful people make when they realize the battlefield has shifted. Charlotte remained beside Kessler, close enough that his red coat brushed her sleeve. She wasn't crying now, wasn't shaking, just standing quietly while the world rearranged itself around her. 2 more security officers materialized from different positions around the forecourt, not rushing, not making a scene, but repositioning themselves with the kind of quiet efficiency that suggested this wasn't improvisation anymore. Someone higher up the chain had made a decision. Behind the barriers, he noticed something else. A woman with greying hair and the expensive camera had lowered her lens completely. She was staring at the royal enclosure with her mouth slightly open, like she was seeing something she'd never expected to witness. Next to her, a teenage boy was whispering urgently to his father in what sounded like German. Word was spreading through the crowd in whispers and pointed glances. Not panic or excitement, but the kind of recognition that comes when people realize they're witnessing something significant. Something that would be talked about for years. The security officer looked at her with the kind of gentle professionalism reserved for children who had been through something difficult. "You're safe now, Your Royal Highness." Charlotte nodded once, a small movement that carried enormous weight. Then she looked up at Kessler with an expression that held no fear, no anxiety, no careful performance, just gratitude. "You listened," she said quietly. Kessler inclined his head slightly, his formal bearing intact, despite everything that had just changed. "Any guard would have done the same, Your Highness." But they both knew that wasn't true. Only one guard had been watching carefully enough to see what was really happening. Only one had been willing to throw away his career when listening mattered more than following orders. The ceremony resumed slowly, like a machine remembering how to function after an unexpected shutdown, but the atmosphere had fundamentally shifted. Guards along the perimeter remained in formation, but Kessler caught the almost imperceptible nods from two of his section mates. Johnson, who'd done 3 tours in Iraq, Davies, whose younger sister had escaped an abusive foster place. They understood. They would have done the same. Other changes were more subtle, but no less significant. The Royal Protection Command had quietly repositioned. Where before their focus had been on external threats, protesters, unauthorized cameras, crowd control, now their attention included internal dynamics. 2 plainclothes officers remained within the royal enclosure, not as ceremony participants, but as observers. The tourists had noticed too. Conversations in multiple languages buzzed through the barriers as people processed what they'd witnessed. An elderly woman near the front was crying openly, not from emotion, but from recognition. She kept saying something in French to her companion, pointing at Charlotte with protective anger. Behind the royal section, a palace aide was speaking rapidly into a secure radio, using codes Kessler didn't recognize. But he knew urgency when he heard it. This wasn't damage control anymore. This was crisis management. But everything had changed. Word spread through the palace staff within hours. Kessler could see it in the way security officers touched their earpieces, the slight pause before responding to whatever they were hearing. Within palace walls, phones were ringing. Private secretaries were having very quiet, very urgent conversations. This wasn't just about a guard breaking protocol anymore. This was about what that breach had revealed. The investigation took 3 days. Review boards, parliamentary questions, headlines across every newspaper in Britain. But the footage spoke for itself. A child's plea for help. A guard's response. A system that finally worked the way it was supposed to. Within hours of the incident, something unprecedented happened. Palace staff who'd witnessed other interactions began coming forward, not publicly, nothing that dramatic, but through proper channels. A housekeeping supervisor mentioned how Charlotte had started flinching whenever Camilla entered rooms during family visits. A kitchen aide recalled seeing unexplained finger-shaped bruises on the girl's upper arms during an informal lunch. A protocol officer admitted he'd noticed Charlotte's behaviour becoming increasingly withdrawn during public events where Camilla was present. Individually, none of it seemed damning. Royal children were under constant pressure. Everyone knew that. But collectively, the reports painted a picture that security officials could no longer ignore. The American tourists who'd been filming the ceremony became crucial witnesses. Their footage, shot from multiple angles, captured details the official palace cameras had missed. The moment Camilla's grip tightened on Charlotte's wrist. The girl's involuntary recoil. The way she'd looked around desperately before spotting Kessler. More importantly, they'd caught something else entirely. Camilla's face during those whispered conversations. Without audio, lip readers brought in to analyse the footage could only make educated guesses, but her expressions told the story clearly enough. This hadn't been the first time. Behind closed doors, the reckoning was more complex. Palace staff, who'd suspected but never spoken, came forward with their own observations. The way Charlotte flinched when certain people approached, how she'd grown quieter over recent months. Small incidents that seemed minor individually, but painted a clear pattern together. The reforms came quietly, without fanfare. New protocols for monitoring interactions with royal children, independent welfare officers, regular check-ins that couldn't be scheduled or prepared for. Changes that should have existed years ago, but took one guard's decision to make them necessary. Sergeant Adam Kessler kept his post. Got a commendation, actually, though he never talked about it. More importantly, he was quietly reassigned to Charlotte's permanent security detail. A posting that looked routine on paper, but carried profound meaning for everyone involved. It meant trust. It meant watch over her. Princess Charlotte attended the next ceremony a month later with the same quiet dignity, but something had changed in her bearing. She stood taller, looked around more freely, smiled when she felt like smiling. And when she caught Kessler's eye across the forecourt, she touched her chest once, just over her heart. A small gesture that meant everything. Recognition between two people who understood that courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a child finding her voice when no one else will listen. Sometimes it's a soldier choosing humanity over tradition. Sometimes it's knowing that the right choice and the easy choice are never the same thing. What would you have done if you'd seen that plea for help? Do you think there are moments when breaking the rules is the most honourable thing you can do? And how many other children are standing in plain sight, waiting for someone to finally listen when they ask for help? Let us know in the comments below where you're watching from and whether you think Sergeant Kessler made the right choice. If stories like this remind you why courage matters, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss what we post next. Share this with someone who needs to remember that real heroes are the ones who act when everyone else is just watching. Your next story is waiting on the screen. Click it now, and I'll see you tomorrow with another moment that proves the same truth. Sometimes the most important protocol is the one that says, protect the innocent, no matter what it costs.